The air still smelled like roses from the wedding bouquet I helped arrange. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had watched my daughter Leona walk down the aisle in a gown I helped pay for, into a life I thought I was part of. Her face had glowed, and I had smiled through tears, proud and quietly hopeful that despite the emotional distance growing between us, love would find its way back into the cracks of our bond. But the morning after the wedding, the fairy tale ended. When I pulled into the driveway of the house I had owned for over 3 decades, something immediately felt wrong. My key didn't work. I tried again. No click, no give. Confused, I rang the bell. No answer. I called Leona's phone. No answer. Then I noticed the boxes. My belongings, neatly taped, labeled, and left on the porch like a donation. I stood there, stunned. This was the home Robert and I had bought after our 2nd anniversary. We raised Leona in its halls. She took her first steps in that kitchen. Her father passed away in the bedroom she had just moved into with her new husband, and now I was locked out of it. The door finally opened. Leona appeared in her robe, not sheepish or apologetic, but calm, cold. "Mom, you're back early," she said. "Early?" "I was supposed to come home today." Her eyes darted briefly. "Bryce and I talked about it. We just think it's time you moved on. We need space to start our life." I stared at her, not comprehending. "You mean the house? This house?" She nodded. "I mean, you've been living here alone for years. It made sense to start fresh." "Leona, this is my house." Before she could respond, Bryce appeared behind her, shirtless, grinning. "It's our house now. We're married. It's time for new beginnings." He said it like it was a business transaction, clean, impersonal, dismissive. "My things—" "We packed them," he interrupted. "It's all out here. We didn't want to make it messy." The word messy stuck in my throat. I could feel eyes from across the street watching. Our neighbor, Mrs. Trenton, pretending to water her azaleas, clearly horrified by what she was witnessing. My hands trembled. "I want to come inside." Leona stepped forward. "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Don't make this harder." The betrayal hit deeper than any wound I'd known. This wasn't just about property. It was about erasure. I had poured my life into that home, and into her, and in a single day, she had reduced it all to labeled boxes and a locked door. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I turned, picked up the smallest box marked kitchen, and walked back to my car. I could feel the tears hot in my throat, but I held them down. There would be a time to cry. But this wasn't it. As I drove away, the morning sun hit the windshield like a spotlight. I was humiliated. I was heartbroken. But I was also beginning to remember something I had forgotten for a long time. I still held the deed. And the next time I came back, it wouldn't be with a suitcase. It would be with the truth and the keys. My name is Vivian Hale. I'm 62 years old, a retired school teacher, a widow, and for the last 10 years, I've lived in the same 2-story craftsman-style house just outside of Charlotte. The garden out front was my husband Robert's favorite place. He used to say the hydrangeas bloomed better when he talked to them. I never had the heart to tell him they were just hardy plants with stubborn roots. After he passed, I kept talking to them anyway. That house meant more to me than any piece of paper ever could. It was where I brought Leona home from the hospital after she was born, where we celebrated birthdays with too much frosting and too little table space, where we watched old movies on Friday nights because we couldn't afford vacations but could afford popcorn and laughter. Every corner of that home had fingerprints of my love, my life, my losses. When Robert died of pancreatic cancer in 2011, the house got quiet. So quiet I'd sometimes leave the TV on at night just to feel like someone else was breathing under the same roof. Leona was in college by then, starting a life I had prayed every day she'd grow bold enough to build. I didn't want her to stay out of obligation. I wanted her to fly, and she did. Law school, a corporate job. designer shoes I couldn't pronounce. I was proud of her. I still am. But pride is complicated when love turns one-sided. Over the years, she grew more distant. Less calls, shorter visits. The warmth that once existed between us seemed to cool like a stove turned off and forgotten. She wasn't unkind, just distracted. Like I had become an artifact from a life she was ready to rewrite. Still, when she got engaged to Bryce Dalton, I threw myself into the planning, like it was my second job. Bryce was handsome, successful, and, at least on the surface, charming. But something in my gut never quite settled with him. He had a salesman's grin, the kind that was always a little too wide and rarely reached the eyes. They insisted on having the wedding in our backyard. "It's beautiful, Mom," Leona said, "and it'll save so much money." So I said yes. I hired a landscaper to freshen up the garden. I rented white folding chairs, a floral arch, even paid extra for an open bar. I moved into the guest room so Leona could take the master and have space to prep with her bridesmaids. For 3 months, the house I had cherished became a wedding venue, a showroom, a stage. And I was the crew. I cooked. I cleaned. I smiled through every disagreement and handled the seating chart when she said it was too stressful. I listened to her vent about vendors, her in-laws, even Bryce himself. I held her when she had a breakdown over the dress fitting, because that's what mothers do. The night before the wedding, I sat alone on the back porch, drinking a glass of wine and looking at the twinkling string lights Robert once hung for our 25th anniversary. I missed him that night more than I had in years. He would have known what to say. He would have seen through Bryce. He would have reminded me that love doesn't mean letting people walk on your back like a welcome mat. I had spent years trying not to make waves, trying to stay useful, present, needed. But the truth was, I had slowly made myself smaller and smaller, just to fit into whatever corner my daughter would allow. And now, it all made sense. The glances between Leona and Bryce, the quiet way she had asked about the deed a few months ago, the suggestion, framed casually, that maybe it was time I considered moving into a retirement community. At the time, I laughed it off. But now, I could see the arc forming. The plan. The ease with which they must have discussed it all behind closed doors. Bryce had always been strategic, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, had followed his lead. But here's what neither of them considered. I wasn't just some fragile woman clinging to her past. I was a wife who buried her husband with dignity, a teacher who guided hundreds of children, a mother who sacrificed everything for her child, and above all, I was the legal owner of that house. Robert and I had always agreed, the deed stays in my name. It wasn't out of mistrust, it was protection. Life is unpredictable, and Robert had always said, "Vivian, you need to hold the roof over your head, no matter what." He was right, and thank God I listened. So that morning, when I drove away from my own porch, past the boxes labeled bathroom and books, past the neighbors who pretended not to stare, I wasn't just heartbroken, I was ignited. Because this wasn't just about a home, it was about a mother who had been taken for granted one too many times. And if Leona and Bryce thought they could erase me from the life I built, they had forgotten one thing. I still had the keys, and I was about to remind them exactly who built that house and who could take it back. The next few hours after I left my own front porch were a blur. I drove around for a while with no real destination, just trying to keep the car moving so I wouldn't fall apart. The boxes in my trunk bounced with every turn, reminders that I no longer had a place in the very home I had built from the ground up, the very home I raised my daughter in, the home I thought I would grow old in. Eventually, I ended up at Corinne's place, my older sister, the only person who knew how to hold me together without pretending everything was fine. When I walked through her door and set down that sad box labeled kitchen, she didn't ask questions. She just wrapped me in her arms. "I knew something was off," she said later, handing me a hot cup of tea. The way Leona spoke about the house like it was already hers. I didn't want to say anything, Viv. I hoped I was wrong. I nodded, numb. She changed the locks, left my things on the porch. Corinne stared at me for a long moment. She kicked her own mother out of her home. After everything? Everything. The word hit hard, because it wasn't just a roof and walls. It was the mortgage payments I made while working double shifts, the kitchen I remodeled with my own tax refund, the garden I kept alive through seasons of grief after Robert's passing. It was Christmas mornings and birthday candles. It was the place where I sewed Leona's prom dress, the place where I'd prayed every night that she'd grow up kind. And now, here I was, displaced, discarded. I hadn't cried yet. Not really. But that night, I did. Corinne sat beside me, her hand on my back, as the tears came in waves. I cried for the humiliation, for the betrayal, for the sharp realization that Leona had stopped seeing me as a mother long before she showed it. Somewhere along the way, I had become an obligation, a placeholder to move around when more important things came into view. Bryce. I thought about him too. How smug he had looked in the doorway, standing there like a man who had won something, like he had finally finished convincing my daughter that I was in the way. I remembered a conversation with Robert when Leona was about 12. He had looked at me across our dinner table and said, "Promise me, Viv. If anything happens to me, don't let anyone ever take this house from you, not even Leona." At the time, I'd scolded him for even thinking something so outlandish, but he'd insisted. She'll grow up, she'll love hard, maybe someone will twist her thinking. But you, this house, it's your safety. Keep the deed in your name, just in case. Just in case. The words echoed in my mind as I wiped my face with a tissue and stood up. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I went to the hall closet in Corinne's guest bedroom and pulled out the old leather satchel where I kept all my important documents. There it was, folded neatly inside a plastic sleeve, the deed to the house. My name, no co-signers, no transfers, just me. And suddenly something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it made room for something else. Resolve. They had counted me out, treated me like an afterthought. But I wasn't powerless. I wasn't a guest. And I damn sure wasn't leaving quietly. I scheduled a meeting with a local attorney that afternoon. I brought the deed, the tax records, and every receipt that tied me to that house. She reviewed everything and smiled. "They have no legal claim," she said. "You are the sole owner. If they don't vacate voluntarily, you can file for an eviction. It's your right." I sat back in the chair and took a deep breath. I hadn't felt that much control in years, but this wasn't just about legality. This was about respect, about dignity, about reminding my daughter and myself that being a mother didn't mean being a martyr. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept seeing her face, kept replaying the coldness in her voice. But I also remembered how she used to hold my hand when she was scared, how she'd crawl into my bed after a nightmare. And now, here we were, strangers separated not by miles, but by entitlement and arrogance. Bryce had seen me as a burden from the start. I could feel it. The way he looked around the house like it was already his. The way he constantly made comments about upgrades, about starting fresh, about how he could finally take care of Leona now. I wanted to scream, to storm back in and shout them out of my life. But instead, I chose something stronger. Silence, preparation, and truth. The next morning, I woke up, showered, and got dressed in my Sunday best. I brushed my hair, put on my grandmother's gold brooch, and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had built a life, who had been pushed aside, and who was about to take it all back, gracefully, but firmly. The plan was clear. I would go back. Not to argue, not to beg, but to reclaim what was mine. Not just a house, but my place in the story. And this time, I wouldn't be the one walking away. The morning I returned to the house, the sky was overcast and heavy, as though it too was holding its breath. I pulled up slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the veins in my arms stood out. I wasn't sure what I expected. Fireworks? An apology? Maybe a little shame from my daughter when she saw my face. But the house was quiet. Too quiet. The lawn was still littered with petals from the wedding. The arch in the backyard was half collapsed, a forgotten relic of a celebration that had ended with betrayal. I parked at the curb and stepped out, the deed folder clutched tightly under my arm. I wore my best blouse, the navy silk one with the pearl buttons Robert had bought me for my birthday the year before he passed. My slacks were pressed. My hair was neatly pinned. If they were going to see me today, it would be on my terms, dignified, composed, and in full command of the facts. I walked slowly to the front porch, each step steady and deliberate. My knees ached, but I didn't let it show. I rang the bell. A pause. Then the door opened. It was Bryce. He looked surprised, but only for a second. Then the same smug smirk returned to his face. "Didn't expect you to come back so soon," he said casually, leaning against the door frame like he'd owned it for years. "Is Leona home?" He shrugged. "She's resting. Wedding stress. Maybe it's best if you just leave whatever you came to say in a text." I smiled. A small, calm smile. Then I opened the folder and held up the deed. Bryce's eyes flickered. "This," I said slowly, carefully, "is the original deed to this house. In my name. Only mine. Not yours. Not Leona's." He straightened. "I don't think you want to play games, Vivian. This is going to turn into something ugly." "It already has," I said. "When you locked me out of my own house, Bryce. When you humiliated me on my own porch, you thought I'd walk away. But you forgot something." I stepped forward close enough to lower my voice but sharpen my words. "You forgot that I built this place. I made every payment, signed every line, painted every wall. There's no version of this story where you get to claim it just because you married into it." His face shifted. Less confident now, more calculating. "We can work something out. No need to make this legal." I let the silence stretch. Then, "It already is legal. I saw an attorney, and if you and my daughter don't vacate this home by Friday, I'll have law enforcement escort you out." He blinked. The confidence drained from his expression like water down a sink. "Vivian, be reasonable. Leona made her choice, and now I'm making mine." Just then, Leona appeared at the top of the stairs, robe cinched tight around her waist, eyes red like she'd been crying or just woken up, or maybe both. "Mom? What are you doing here?" Bryce turned to her quickly, as if trying to get ahead of the conversation. "She brought the deed." Leona's mouth opened, then closed again. She came down slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd—" "Kick me out? Replace the locks? Throw my memories onto the lawn?" She winced. "I just thought we needed space, a clean start." "You thought wrong." Her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I wanted to hold her, to remind her of the nights I stayed up with her when she had fevers, the stories I told her during storms. But that wasn't what she needed. She needed to remember who I was, not a burden, not a placeholder. Her mother. I took a deep breath. I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to reclaim what's mine. You have until Friday. Bryce stepped forward. "We're not leaving." "Then a sheriff will help you pack." I turned, walked down the steps, and didn't look back. It wasn't just the deed that gave me power. It was the truth, the knowledge that I had bent over backwards for years, and when I finally stood up straight, they didn't recognize me. But that was fine. They would now. And I had 3 days to prepare for the next chapter, one where I was no longer invisible, one where I stopped asking to belong in the house I built and took back the keys myself. The drive back to Corinne's that morning was the quietest one yet. No radio, no calls, just the rhythm of the tires on asphalt and my thoughts pulsing loud in my ears. I didn't cry, I didn't shout, I didn't replay the confrontation like a victory. Because even though I had made my position clear, there was no triumph in watching your own child's face crumble under the weight of what she never thought you'd do. Corinne was on the porch when I pulled in, her coffee already in hand like she'd been waiting for the play-by-play. But one look at my face, and she said nothing. She simply stepped aside and let me in. Over the next 3 days, I didn't rush. I didn't storm social media or call anyone to take sides. I simply began reclaiming my identity, slowly, methodically, the way you wash away years of dust before unveiling something worth showing again. I gathered paperwork, spoke again to my lawyer, ensuring every step I was taking had legal weight. Corinne helped me dig through storage for the boxes of Robert's letters, old receipts, the original blueprints, things that reminded me I hadn't just lived in that house. I had built it, brick by brick, year by year. On the second day, I went to the hardware store, not to change locks yet, that would come later, but I picked up paint swatches, tile samples, the same types I used to look at with Robert, imagining a new backsplash or a garden upgrade, not because I needed to renovate, but because visualizing the future helped sever the trauma of the present. In between, I journaled. Not the kind of journaling where you try to find peace in pain. Number this was raw, honest, sometimes ugly. I wrote, "What breaks more than a woman's heart is the moment she realizes she raised someone who stopped seeing her as a human." And later, she didn't just shut me out, she decided she had outgrown me, like a dress you once loved but now wrinkle your nose at. Each night I sat outside on Corinne's patio, looking up at the stars and thinking about how far I had come from the woman I once was, the one who apologized for speaking too loud, for taking up space, for being in the way. On the third morning, I woke up before dawn. I sat at Corinne's kitchen table in my robe, cradling a cup of chamomile tea when she walked in. "You ready?" she asked. I looked at her. Not just at her face, but into the life we had shared as sisters. The fights, the triumphs, the births and funerals. "Yes," I said. "I'm not just going to reclaim the house. I'm going to bless it before I walk in. I'm not carrying any more of their shame into those walls." We drove together, this time with the back seat filled with a few of my things. Not boxes, just tokens. A framed photo of Robert and me from our anniversary, a small vase for fresh-cut daisies, my own coffee mug. This time, I didn't ring the doorbell. This time, I used the spare key I had always kept hidden behind the siding. The house was still. Leona and Bryce had left, as expected. There were a few boxes by the door with labels I refused to read. One had my name scrawled in red ink. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I walked slowly through the house, touching every surface like it was a familiar face. The wooden banister worn smooth from years of hands running along it. The dining room table where Leona had once sat with scraped knees and stories about her third-grade crush. I stood in the living room and let the silence speak. This was mine again. Not because a lawyer said so, but because I was finally standing in it, not as a guest, not as a mother waiting for permission, but as a woman who had earned every inch of it. I lit a candle. I said Robert's name out loud. I stood in the center of the room and whispered, "I'm home." Not as an act of revenge, not as a woman scorned, but as the rightful owner of her story. 3 days had changed me, not because I had gained power, but because I had remembered I'd never lost it. The house may have been mine again, but it didn't feel like home yet. It smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Leona had changed the candles in the living room, switched the floral throw pillows I'd kept for years with those cold, geometric ones. The family photos were gone, replaced by abstract art I didn't recognize. Even the kitchen towels were different. Mine had daisies. These were slate gray, small things, but they hit like stones. I walked through the house in silence, pausing in each room like I was absorbing the damage. Not physical, but emotional. You don't realize how easily someone can erase your presence until they start doing it slowly, one forgotten picture at a time, One drawer emptied, one blanket tossed. It's like grief in reverse. Instead of mourning a loss, you discover you've become the ghost. The quiet was broken by the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I glanced out the window. Leona. She was alone this time. She parked at the curb instead of the driveway like she wasn't sure she had the right to enter. I watched her sit there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, then finally step out. Her face was unreadable, but her posture gave her away, tense, defensive. She rang the doorbell. I waited before opening it. Part of me wanted to let her wait, to give her a taste of the exclusion she had so easily served me, but I couldn't. "Hi, Mom," she said, voice small. It took everything in me not to crumble right there, because despite everything, despite how she'd hurt me, she was still my daughter. The little girl who once clung to my legs when I dropped her off at kindergarten. The one who used to write me notes in crayon that said, "You're the best mommy in the world." "Come in," I said. She stepped inside and looked around like it was unfamiliar, like she was the guest now. Her eyes moved across the surfaces, and I could see her taking in what had changed, what I had returned to its rightful place. "Where's Bryce?" I asked. "At work. He didn't want to come." "I'm not surprised." She flinched at that. Good. Let the truth sting. Maybe then it would stick. We sat at the kitchen table. I made tea. She didn't touch hers. I placed a napkin under the cup anyway. That muscle memory of care, it doesn't die easily. "I didn't think you'd actually go through with it," she said after a while, eyes trained on the steam rising between us. I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch. Silence is a language of its own, a mother's way of saying, "You don't get to control this room anymore." She glanced down at her hands. "You really called a lawyer." "I did." "And you're serious about making us leave?" "I already did." She bit her lip. "Bryce thinks you're doing this to punish us." "This isn't punishment, Leona. It's protection. You made your choice. You told me, without hesitation, that this house was yours now. You packed my things and left them on the porch like I was a stranger." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. "You hurt me. Not just because you wanted the space, but because you didn't even consider asking. You didn't show me the basic respect of a conversation. You treated me like a burden, like dead weight to cut off now that your life had really begun." She looked down. "It wasn't supposed to go like that." Bryce said. I held up a hand. Don't put this on him. He may have pushed the idea, but you followed through. You stood on that porch and watched me walk away. You turned your back on the woman who stayed up nights sewing your Halloween costumes, who skipped vacations to afford your tuition. She nodded slowly. "I thought you'd understand, that you wanted to move on, too. That's what hurt the most, that you assumed I didn't belong here anymore, that you believed, somehow, that the years I spent pouring into this home, into you, could just be boxed up and discarded." We sat there in silence again, a long, heavy stillness. I watched the way she curled her fingers around the hem of her sweater, the way her eyes darted around the room like she didn't know where to look. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And for the first time, I believed she meant it. But forgiveness and return were two different things. "I love you, Leona. I always will. But love doesn't mean surrendering my dignity. You want to rebuild something with me? Then you do it honestly, slowly, and from the outside. Because you don't get to walk back into this house like nothing happened." She swallowed hard, tears spilling freely now. "What happens next?" I looked her in the eye. "You go live your life. Build your home. I'll be here. Not waiting, but living." It wasn't a dramatic ending. There were no slam doors, no parting screams, just two women sitting in the remains of something broken, finally seeing each other clearly. She stood to leave. At the door, she turned. "Do you think we'll ever be the same again?" I shook my head. "Number. But maybe we'll be something better. different, but honest. And with that, she left. I locked the door behind her, not as an act of exclusion, but as a right, a declaration. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled, not in anger, not in relief, but in release. Because confronting your child is the hardest thing a mother can do. But sometimes, loving them means telling them no, means standing on your own 2 feet, even when your knees are shaking. That day, I chose myself. And in doing so, I opened a door that had been shut for far too long, the one back to me. After the door closed behind Leona, the silence felt deeper than before. Not empty, but vast, like the house was exhaling too. I didn't move for a long time. I stood there, one hand still on the lock, the other trembling just slightly, my breath finally steady, my spine straighter than it had felt in years. I walked back into the kitchen, untouched tea still sitting on the table. I poured both cups down the sink. There was something cathartic in it, letting go of what was left behind, even if it was just cooling water in china cups. That afternoon, I didn't clean. I didn't busy myself with laundry or gardening. I sat in the living room, my living room, with Robert's old flannel blanket over my lap. I watched the wind shift the curtains and let the quiet fill me up like water poured into a long, dry well. It was over. The confrontation, the humiliation, the shock. But something else had begun, and I felt it swelling in my chest, a strange mixture of sadness, pride, and power. I had stood up to my own child. I had faced her not with spite, but with clarity. I had told her the truth. By the next morning, the word had spread. I received a call from Elaine, an old friend from the church book club. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice laced with a mix of disbelief and concern. "I can't imagine the strength it took." Neither could I. Not really. You never know how much you can bear until you're tested, until you're the one standing at the edge, deciding whether to fall or to fly. That week, the house started changing, not because I was rearranging things, but because I was seeing them differently. I went into Leona's old room. It still had the pale green walls she once begged for in middle school. I found an old box in the closet, notes, pictures, drawings. I sat on the floor and went through them one by one, smiling and crying in equal measure. That night, I pulled out the will Robert and I had drafted years ago. I sat with it for hours, not to revise it out of anger, but to reaffirm that what we had built together mattered, and that no one had the right to erase it while I was still living and breathing. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in nearly a decade. I danced. Not with anyone else, just me in the living room, barefoot on the hardwood floor. I played an old Motown record and let the music lift the weight off my shoulders. I laughed. I twirled. I sang to no one but the walls and Robert's picture on the mantel. I was alive, fully, fiercely. That weekend, I invited Corinne over for dinner. She brought peach cobbler and a bottle of wine. We ate on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the trees like it always used to. She didn't bring up Leona until the very end of the night. "Do you think she'll come back?" I paused. "I think she'll try, but next time it won't be as a resident. It'll be as a visitor. A daughter, yes, but one who understands this home has roots she can no longer claim without care." Corinne nodded. "You did right, Viv, even when it felt wrong." I thought about that for a long time, because that's what growth often feels like, wrong before it feels right, like pruning a tree. You cut it back, it looks bare, but give it time, and it blooms stronger. Days turned into weeks. The house grew quieter, but not in a lonely way, in a peaceful way. I began a new routine. Mornings on the porch with coffee and a journal, afternoons spent volunteering at the local library, evenings with puzzles, movies, or just stillness. One morning, I got a letter, handwritten, from Leona. "Mom, I don't know how to start this without shame. I've tried so many times to write, but every word sounded hollow. What I did was wrong. It was selfish, cruel, and I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. But I hope someday you'll let me try to earn it. Not with grand gestures, but with time. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Love always, Leona. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it inside my journal. I didn't write back, not yet, but I smiled, because it meant she was listening, and that was enough. This was the climax of my story. Not fireworks, not a tearful reunion, but the quiet reclaiming of a woman who had been erased by motherhood, duty, and assumption. I had taken my name back, my home back, myself back. And now I was writing the rest of the story on my terms. In ink, not pencil. Permanent. Grief is strange, not always loud or sudden, it's quiet. It lingers like a draft in a closed room, a shift in the air that no one else seems to feel. After Leona's letter, the grief that had been clinging to me like fog began to lift, but not completely. It remained in soft moments, in the pause before answering the phone, in the glance toward the door at dinner time. I didn't reply to her letter right away, and I didn't tell anyone I'd received it. Not Corinne, not Elaine, not even the sweet clerk at the market who always asked how my daughter was. Because I wasn't ready to open the door again, not even a crack. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life that had grown dusty. I joined the gardening club at the community center. I hosted a book night at my house just like I used to. It felt strange at first, laughing with others in a home that had so recently echoed with tension. But slowly the walls began to warm again, and then something unexpected happened. I began to feel proud, not of what I had endured, but of how I had endured it. I hadn't lashed out. I hadn't sought revenge. I had stood tall, clear, calm. That's not something we talk about enough, how much strength there is in dignity. One evening, I was organizing my bookshelf when I found a framed photo tucked behind some old novels. It was of Leona and me at her college graduation. We were both younger, of course, her hair curled just the way she liked it. Me in the dress she'd picked out for me because she said it made me look soft and strong. I sat on the floor and stared at that photo for a long time, not because I missed her, but because I finally understood the fullness of what I had carried all these years. Not just memories, but hopes. Hopes for the kind of mother I'd be, the kind of woman she'd become, the kind of relationship we'd one day share. Somewhere in those dreams, I forgot something essential. I existed beyond her. I had worth outside of her affection. And that realization didn't feel bitter. It felt like freedom. I finally wrote back, not a long letter, just enough. Leona, thank you for your letter. I needed to hear those words, not because they erase what happened, but because they mean you finally see it. I'm not closing the door, but I'm not opening it all the way either. Rebuilding takes time and trust. If you're willing to walk that road slowly, I'll meet you halfway. Love, Mom. I mailed it the next morning. No fanfare, no expectation, just a reply, a seed planted. Corinne came by that afternoon and found me in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. Looks like they're blooming early this year, she said. I looked up. They know the soil's changing. She smiled, setting down a basket of peaches. So are you. And she was right. I had, not into someone new, but into someone I'd always been, beneath the layers of sacrifice and silence. I was still a mother, still a widow, still a woman who'd given more than she should have. But now I was also a woman who had learned to give to herself. A few weeks later, a car pulled into the driveway. Not Leona's, Bryce's. I stayed at the window, watched him step out, hesitate, then walk to the door and ring the bell. I didn't answer. He rang again. Still, I didn't move. And then he left. That moment felt like closure. Not because he walked away, but because I chose not to invite him back in. Not with words, not with warmth, not with anything. Closure, I realized, isn't something you get from other people. It's a decision. A quiet drawing of the line where your story begins again. In the months that followed, I did more than reclaim my house. I reclaimed the rhythms of a life that once felt like it was fading. I traveled with Corinne to Asheville, took up watercolor painting, donated books to the school I used to teach at. I lived, and in that living, I found peace. Not the kind you sit down and wait for, the kind you earn through fire, through loneliness, through boundaries drawn with trembling hands and unwavering hearts. So when the doorbell rings now, I don't flinch. I walk to the door on my own time, open it when I choose, because this is my home, and more importantly, this is my life, fully mine, no longer shared by force, but offered by choice. Time does something miraculous when you let it. It doesn't heal all wounds, whoever said that was lying, but it reshapes them, turns the sharp edges into something you can hold without bleeding. It smooths the surface of sorrow until it becomes part of you instead of something pressing against you. I didn't expect clarity, but I got it in small pieces. It came in the sound of birds outside my window during morning tea, in the rustle of paper when I reopened my journal after years of blank pages, in the quiet laughter between Corinne and me while we baked a peach pie and argued about crust thickness. It came in ordinary moments, the kind I used to skip past while pouring everything into others. The garden bloomed wildly that spring, not just the roses, but everything. It was like the earth could feel that something had shifted in me. I tended it daily, finding joy in soil-stained fingertips and sun-warmed shoulders. Neighbors stopped by more often, complimenting the tulips or asking for tomato tips. I gave freely, but this time without giving away pieces of myself. People began to notice. Elaine said, "You look lighter." Like something's changed. It has, I told her. I stopped asking for permission to matter. That became my mantra. I wrote it on a sticky note and placed it on my fridge. I repeated it to myself when I hesitated before saying no. I let it guide me when I sat down to write my first article for the local paper's community column, What We Keep After We Let Go. I spoke not about Leona directly, but about the slow unraveling of self that can happen in motherhood. How loving deeply is not the same as erasing ourselves. How boundaries are not walls. They are doors we choose to open with intention. The response was overwhelming. Emails, letters, women who had raised children alone, grandmothers raising grandchildren, retirees rediscovering their creativity. They all echoed the same thing. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. One afternoon, I visited the library I once worked at and found my favorite reading chair still there. I asked if I could volunteer again. Within a week, I was helping children with story time. Watching their little faces light up over picture books felt like poetry, reminding me that there was still joy to be found in teaching, in nurturing, in being part of a community. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. There were still days when memories hit like a gust of wind through a cracked window. I'd pass a young woman laughing on her phone and think of Leona. I'd hear a mother and daughter bickering in the grocery aisle and feel a pang deep in my chest. But those moments didn't undo me. I let them pass through, because I'd learned to hold pain differently, to see it not as proof of failure, but as evidence of love that was once so full it hurt when it broke. A few months after I mailed my letter, Leona sent another, this time shorter. A thank you, an update about work, a request to meet for lunch sometime, when I was ready. I folded the note and placed it in my journal beside the first. I wasn't ready, but I wasn't angry either. That too was growth. Growth didn't come wrapped in ribbon. It came in silence, in intention. In the steady beat of my heart when I woke up and realized I had no one to impress, no role to perform, no burden to carry that didn't belong to me. I went for long walks in the woods, took pictures of dew on leaves, read mystery novels I'd always skipped for the sake of more important things. I painted a canvas and hated it, but I hung it anyway, because it reminded me that I was here, alive, still creating even if it wasn't perfect, still worthy even if no one else said it out loud. I didn't know what the future with Leona would look like, but I knew this. She would never again define me, because I had finally done what no one else could do for me. I had become whole, without permission, and that was the beginning of everything. It's funny how a house can feel different depending on how you walk through it. Today, I don't tiptoe. I don't pause at doorways like I'm waiting for permission. I walk slowly, steadily, like the walls remember who I am now, and I remember them. It's been nearly a year since the day Leona closed the door behind her and left me standing in the silence. A year since I chose to open a different kind of door, the one back to myself. And now, standing in the very center of this home, I realize this wasn't just a house. It was a mirror, a map, a monument to everything I almost lost. But more than that, it was the beginning of the life I hadn't dared to live yet. I kept that first box Leona packed for me, the one labeled kitchen. I never unpacked it. Instead, I placed it on the top shelf of the guest room closet, not as a wound, but as a reminder. We all have things we're told to carry, expectations, roles, traditions. But some things, once boxed, are better left there. I see Leona now and then, a phone call every few weeks. We did meet for lunch, eventually. It was awkward, tender, careful, but not hollow. She brought a bouquet of tulips and apologized again. I accepted, but not in the way I would have a year ago, because forgiveness, I've learned, is not the same as reopening the door. It's placing a gate there, one only you have the key to. We hugged. We laughed a little. We cried more. She left before dessert, but she left something else behind. A real attempt. Not a demand. That was enough. I didn't write this story to gain sympathy. I wrote it to give voice to the women who've given too much, who handed over the keys to their homes, their hearts, their futures, and were told they should be grateful just to be remembered, no more. I am not a relic. I am not an afterthought. I am the author of this chapter, and the next, and the next. If you're listening and you've ever felt like you were being erased, I want you to hear me now. Your story does not end when someone else tries to write the last line. It begins again, with your name, in bold. I look around my home, and I no longer see the spaces where others tried to make me small. I see shelves filled with books I chose, walls painted colors I love, windows that open to a world I'm finally letting back in. I have dinner with friends now. I garden without guilt. I say no without explanation. I take up space. I laugh loudly. I exist loudly. And I do so with grace, but never silence. Leona is still my daughter, but she is no longer my compass. I've learned to navigate by my own stars, ones I ignored for too long. So if there's one thing I leave you with, let it be this. You can love someone and still walk away. You can forgive someone and still choose peace over proximity. You can survive betrayal and still build beauty in its wake, because I did. This is my home. This is my story. And I am finally, unapologetically, the woman who owns both. The keys are back in my hands, and this time, I'm not handing them over to anyone.